now that I have all of these little pieces and insights laying around on the table, it's almost like little wooden blocks. I can start playing with the way I put them together and the shape and the orientation and just the act of reconfiguring those into new patterns. And so that actually generates new aha moments when you start re-storying or re-plotting or plot twisting. It shakes you out of the old habits and it gives you a fresh insights.
I think it's terribly important to insist on individual values.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Initiative, creation, all these things which we value. It's now possible to make organizations on a larger scale than was ever possible before.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Teach people to analyze the kind of things that are said to them.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Learning Culture Podcast. I am your host, Andrew Barry, and this is a show about creating cultures of learning inside companies. Joining me this week is Dr. Ken Long. Ken is the Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Army, retired. He spent 25 years in active duty and continues to serve with the Army as a professor of change management down at the Fort Leavenworth, Kansas training facility. He works with a staff of over 7,000 faculty and is responsible for teaching over 200,000 students. Boy, oh boy, was this a good conversation. The reason I asked Dr. Long to come onto the podcast was to talk about his side of the story in working with Dr. Angus Fletcher, who is another previous guest on the show. Check out the show notes for a link to that episode. Dr. Fletcher is the one who created a methodology for teaching creativity. As we go into in this episode, this is not like any method for teaching creativity that you have ever seen before. I can promise you that. And both these episodes just scratch the surface, really, of the power and potential of that method. This conversation is about Ken's use of what he calls the Fletcher treatment in working with the Army, the lessons that they learned in how to implement the method, how very little overhead is actually involved in implementing it, the benefits that they saw in terms of the decisions and relationships and problem-solving transactions that happen on a day-to-day basis and how those compound over time. We also talk about how the other work that Ken does in teaching traders in the financial markets using the same methods and how they are quite similar to the Army. We look at the role trust, safety, truth, and opportunity play in creating learning organizations. And we look at how creativity training is adaptable to local conditions, which is exceptionally exciting because it means that your company could benefit from this in very unique and tailored ways. There's so much more to this episode. It was just an absolute joy to record. I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy my episode with Dr. Ken Long. Ken, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Andrew. I'm really humbled and honored to be here and looking forward to our talk. I've been listening to your presentations on a variety of topics, and I'm really excited to share this time and space with you.
Well, I'm beyond excited to do that with you too, and to pick your brain. There's going to be So for listeners who may be familiar, and we'll link this in the show notes, I did an episode towards the beginning of last year, I think, with Dr. Angus Fletcher. And Dr. Ken Long, my guest today, collaborated with Angus Fletcher in the work that you did with the U.S. Army. So we're going to be unpacking all of that around this incredibly fascinating topic of teaching creativity. Now, my first question for you, Ken, in the field guide that Angus wrote, which I have in front of me over here, at the back, he says, and as acknowledgement, the first acknowledgement, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Long for being the catalyst. What does he mean by that?
Well, what he means is he's politely saying that I have a knack for pulling future stakeholders and shareholders together and and then staying out of the way while they do the actual work. So we've brought in a growing group of strange agents that are working together in a variety of ways to implement his ideas. And they all share in common that they know me, and I get out of their way to let them do work. So I've been helpful with outreach and finding connections. It goes back to my background in systems thinking and pulling pieces together into robust systems. And I played that role in this project that he and I were working on together.
Awesome. And on the topic of systems thinking, near and dear to my heart as well, another episode we did on the fifth discipline, which I think is probably one of the seminal works.
Yeah, Peter Senge, beautiful book, wonderfully practical.
Yeah, I love it. And that, on that note, I think that's where a lot of today's conversation is going to go to sort of the practical side of it. So, could you characterize for us the state of affairs, the sort of challenges that the U.S. Army saw that they wanted to solve around this time? You were kind of discovering the Fletcher treatment.
Yeah, well, it's this is still a process of our little research team trying to help the Army understand the trick box that we're in, where we simultaneously recognize that the Army has to be a learning organization and get every brain into the fight if you want to respond in a yin-yang, dynamically changing world. At the same time, the profession has paid a high price to learn our historical lessons. And so a profession really has a commitment to that body of knowledge that has stood the test of time. And so when you see those two imperatives coming together, a need to always be testing and going beyond and almost being experimental and entrepreneurial, and yet preserving all of those hard lessons learned, you now have to find a way to place creativity as a style of thinking, as an approach to thinking, as a cognitive skill, to at the same time trying to preserve some of that status quo and good process management. So it's almost like, as Clayton Christensen talks about, the innovator's dilemma, exploitation versus exploration. So if you think that creativity is important as a signal generator for potential ideas, you then have to say, well, if I had it, what do I do with it? How do I turn that into innovation that pays off quickly? And how do I root through all of the good ideas that aren't ready yet? So if I get creativity, a lot more ideas now, it's actually harder to find the wheat in the chaff, if I can say it that way. So then how do I teach that to a profession? And so we're at the center of Army University here at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Army University has 7,000 faculty and 200,000 students every year in a 1 million person force. So it is simultaneously trying to preserve the goodness and do training and certification and establishing procedures that we could rely on, but at the same time being fresh and innovative. And then how do I scale creativity to all those faculty members who have been hired because of their field expertise? They have proven successful in the world. How do I teach them to become effective teachers for the creativity? So that's some of the challenges we're contending with.
Yeah. I'm fascinated how often this comes up, but the idea of creativity, the creative process and the process of learning being inextricably linked. And we'll come back to that. I want to bookmark that. I want to dive into a little bit more about, you mentioned learning organizations. That's, I think, maybe Peter Senge's term, actually. And how did the Army, could you maybe summarize like how the Army got to that point of saying like, oh yeah, we actually want this, we need this? And also, what is a learning organization?
Yeah, so the Army became a learning organization because we realized that while material, solutions, and doctrine and procedures matter, you are always trying to put them into play against a thinking enemy who's trying to learn what works against you. So if you lose the learning battle at the point of contact, then all of your material and process doesn't matter because they're fighting those single points of failure. So you've got to be on the cutting edge of that learning signal from the environment, from the enemy, from your own people who are trying to find better ways to do things. So if you're not actively engaged in learning, then you're just waiting to react to contact, and you're automatically in second position. So that's untenable. So our last 10 to 15 years has really been trying to understand the human dimension, how to develop our people at every level, and how do we get into the professional, efficient, and effective learning organization that we think will help us on the battlefield.
Yeah. And it reminds me of one of the chapters actually in the field guide that Angus wrote around winning this battle, not the last one, and the story of how the Romans outsmarted Hannibal in 200 BC. So I think one of the things that jumped out at me from that was the importance of flexibility and adaptability and being able to update your knowledge in the moment. And so my question for you is, to what extent or what role does creativity play in doing that?
Well, I would say it works on a couple levels. First of all, you just need the capacity to be creative, to generate the insights when you need them. But there's a second part of that, is that to be able to receive creativity and do something with it, you need a wider, almost cultural mindset that is willing to tolerate some of the inefficiency of creativity, that most of your ideas are not going to be immediately useful, but some of them are. So you've got to learn how to accept a circular path or a spiral path. You're not going to go straight from point A to point B. So the more that you work with creativity, you not only increase your capacity, but you develop an appreciation for the willingness to tolerate indirect pathways. And if you can do that, there's actually a payoff in how you pull together diverse teams. So if you could be patient with the creative process, there's a chance that you could be more patient with diverse team members who are coming at things from different angles. That actually opens you up to a culture of learning that appreciates diversity, is tolerant of alternate points of view. And then finally, you need a way to enjoy those new ideas, but then quickly get them into action, because it does take time to be creative. It takes time to hear the different voices, and then you still have to get that product or solution to market in time to make a difference, whether it's on the battlefield or in the supply chain. So it turns out engaging in creativity is not just generating a list of different ideas, but there's a whole mindset and culture that you really have to install to get the most out of it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful summary, I think, of the approach that, to your point, I think there's something like 26 or 27 modules in this field guide that Angus wrote, and each one of those has practical activities for practicing the skills that we're talking about here, to be able to do the things that you just described. So I wish we could spend the whole day talking about every single one of those, but could you give us a flavor for what it was like? Like, that initial sort of pilot phase of this, and just again, for everyone listening, we're talking about teaching creativity here, which is completely different. And I really want to stress this, is a completely different approach to anything that is done before. It uses more of the brain than any previous approaches like brainstorming, divergent thinking, etc. This is very much new ground we're talking about here. So Ken, with that in as context, what was it like when the Army started implementing the practical activities?
Yeah, so by way of background, I've been on our critical and creative thinking committee at this college for about 15 years. We treat both of those as foundational cognitive skills, and we front load our year-long course with exposure to that. Now, we have, over those 15 years, evolved a traditional means of teaching creativity, but it really was not satisfying. It was much more talking about creativity and, a list of words on a slide and talking about who the big thinkers are and some definitions. We've talked about creativity in 2 hours, and now we can get on with what we want to talk about, which is planning and preparation, right? But at the same time, we knew it was pretty well received by the students who enjoyed the ideas. Faculty became comfortable with teaching those lessons each year, because that really didn't change much. The rest of the curriculum would change a lot, but the creativity and the critical thinking was sort of foundational. There was a comfort level with that. And then all of a sudden, Angus Fletcher starts talking to us, and he says, no, you need to get into the creativity and do it rather than talk about it. And we're going to use the power of our evolutionary brain to be story gatherers, storytellers, communicating through stories. And we're going to unleash the power of that to grow our creative muscles. So we put a research plan together, got it through the Human Subjects Research Committee, which was a marathon. And then we actually assigned the lesson to some teams to teach creativity according to the Fletcher treatment lesson plan. And they got about 1 hour of prep. And I will tell you, about half the guys did not want to teach that because they were used to their ways. And there was some active resistance and disbelief and an hour of preparation compared to the years of preparation they'd had on the traditional model. So we put that into the classroom. We had the students do a before and after creative exercise. And then we assembled a panel of diverse experts to evaluate both the creativity, but also the feasibility and suitability, which is sort of a grounded professional sense of how useful the idea would be, because it's important for a profession to actually have both. So our panel assembled, we evaluated those things. And when we did the math, a double-blind controlled experiment, it turns out that the traditional method moved the needle a little bit and we weren't doing harm, I'll say it that way. But even with the odds against it and only an hour of preparation and an experiential exercise that did not rely on the instructor to be the expert in the room, but just kind of unleash the students, the statistical significance of the improvement in creativity, as we measured it with the consensual assessment technique, which is considered to be the gold standard for evaluating creativity within professions and disciplines, it was a significant improvement. And I look at it this way, that all of the odds were stacked against the test group, the Fletcher treatment, and there was a significant improvement. So we were able to go to our commanding general and show that we have actual evidence that this method, with very little overhead, moved the needle much better than our traditional methods. And my general officer is a good one, and he understood immediately what the implications of that finding were. That for an hour's worth of faculty preparation and that thin little book with 1 or 2 exercises in there, we were able to improve creativity across the board. And what was interesting was it wasn't just with the most creative people, because we did a before and an after, but we were moving the entire distribution a standard deviation to the right. So the less creative became pretty good, the pretty good became really good, and the good became great. So it was a broad application. So when we look at scaling this across our enterprise, I mentioned before 7,000 faculty and 200,000 students, here's the business case, by the way, for this. The world is hungry for creativity, and if you could get a 3% improvement annually on performance and problem solving because you were just a little bit more creative, you might be creative about finding the right problem and then solving it just a little bit better. If you could just get a 3% boost, well, the U.S. Department of Defense annual budget is $1 trillion. Different topic for a different time. But that's a 3% improvement on performance is about $35 billion net present value at the cost of an hour of faculty development. And then my general officer understood that that's just the annual compounded value. If you could get to the transaction level where any 2 soldiers come together and they had both been upgraded in their creativity and their leaders were a little more creative, you now start compounding 3% improvement across every single transaction at every moment across the entire force. And that gives you an astronomical compounded return on investment. So we're really excited about that. And that's why we're seeing a lot of interest in scaling these techniques in schools and organizations across the Army. It's staggering. I actually have one of my students using that to actually, while he's in my class, redesigning the curriculum of a leadership course on another installation, and it's already being executed with good results. So you don't even have to wait to get moving on this stuff. It's really astonishing.
Well, that is staggering, and there's a few points I want to come back to here. I'm going to do this in kind of reverse order. You mentioned at the end that they're measured in the transactions, right? If you multiply it, you compound those transactions. We're talking here things like decisions, relationships, like that's what I really want to impress this again on the listener as well. Like creativity, this is applied creativity. It's applied to very practical day-to-day things that people in the Army or any organization have to do. That's what we're talking about here, right, Ken?
Exactly. So you normally think of practical managers or leaders or our sergeants as problem solvers. Give me a problem and I'll solve it. Once you get exposed to this style of creativity, thinking, and teaching, you back up and first look at the problem frame. Have I correctly diagnosed or sketched out what kind of a problem I have before I start picking the solution to work on it? And then you say, before I even problem frame, did I problem find? Am I actually on the right problem before I frame it and then I solve it? So creativity in the Fletcher treatment frees up that habit of mind. So you start asking yourself that question habitually before you get on with the work that needs to be done. Now, every large organization, every profession has standards of practice. And 19 out of 20 times the good enough solution is good enough. But 1 out of 20 or maybe 2 out of 20, there's a chance that creativity, if you ask the question early enough, frees up an entire new approach or an endeavor. So if you can create that as a routine habit of mind, it really just supports all of the other professional styles of thinking that you have, and it becomes an important tool in the kit.
Right. Yeah, and exactly. And for listeners of this show, we talked about decision-making, problem-solving, relationships. That's conversations you're having with your customers. That's performance conversations between a manager and an individual contributor. These are all examples of transactions in which creativity, the kind that we were talking about here, can be applied and can get that, one standard deviation improvement at times that can compound over time. You also said, and you stressed this twice, that this is done with very little overhead. And I can attest to this because I'm doing a little bit of work with Angus and his wife, and there is really not that much preparation to be able to do this. And I'm curious what your reaction to this. My take on the method is that it is an intentional way to bring people together in conversation with really good questions for prompts.
That's exactly right.
That's it, right? We're not asking them to build, machines out of like different parts and paint pictures or anything like that. We're just engaging people in conversation.
You don't understand your way through chaos. You can only move through it. And traditional rational models of thinking, I got to plan everything first and understand it before I take the first action. That's like leading by snapshot. I take a snapshot, really study it and go forward. But in fact, we're replacing that snapshot with a balancing act. You are dancing or traversing through a chaotic, dynamic landscape. And that asks you to have a little more trust in the brain that brought us to the top of the food chain. We got 10 million years of evolution that have sort of optimized our brain to be able to quickly distinguish between signal and noise, to find the little gem that's going to lead to dramatic breakthroughs. So we have educated ourselves away from that with the Western maybe style of thinking and, expertise. And this is really just a way to quickly get back into the experience of a dynamic brain that is courageously, fearlessly looking for new connections and then celebrating it when we get it and then doing something once we have it. So yeah, very little overhead, return to first principles.
Yeah, and then that dynamic brain you talk about, this is also in Dr. Fletcher's work around, he just talks about intelligence being the combination of logic and creativity. And logic is that equilibrium and stability, and creativity is that asymmetric conflict and uncertainty. And what this method teaches is that you can actually toggle those on and off in your own mind.
Exactly. It's what stance are you taking as we're all we're all standing around this elephant, blind men, trying to figure out what he is. How quickly can I adjust my position and sense and respond and start building a tentative, deeper picture of the true nature of what it is we're studying, and be able to tolerate some of that uncertainty and use that to feed forward into better decisions.
Yeah, and yeah, I love that, and it's sort of made somewhat easier by the belief that, and the truth that no creative idea is either right or wrong. Everything is just there to be tested. And your goal is actually just to generate as many ideas as you can, to test as many as you can.
One of the other insights that we come out of this, once we start evaluating those ideas, is that we don't put them in a discard pile. I want you to think of a carpenter. A master carpenter has a stack of wood that has left over from other projects. He doesn't look at that as scrap wood. He looks at that as wood that he just hasn't found the purpose for yet. So when we have our creative ideas, we realize that that is the gift. And so we just realize that, hey, maybe this isn't the time or place for that really to be put into motion. But don't get rid of that. There will come a time, you can be sure with the law of large numbers, there will come a time and place where that idea has real actionable value now. So don't get rid of those things. And that actually helps us cherish the ideas that are offered but not chosen for implementation. And that helps us build the culture of acceptance and diversity.
Yeah, emphasizing the process rather than the outcome, right? I mean, it's all about that bottoms up, and it's the process of generating these ideas that's the most important thing. I want to probably go down the rabbit hole of creativity a little bit more into two components of it that are in the book, and it's about perspective taking and plot twisting. And I've kind of worked through some of this with them, and so I'd love if you could kind of take the reader. Maybe we want to take each of those separately, and just give some sort of paint a picture, give a bit of color to what we mean by perspective taking and plot twisting.
So I want you to think of the challenge of that elephant, and we're going to circumnavigate the elephant. And what I want to do is get 6 people around that elephant, each with a different point of view, so that I can incorporate their unique perspective. Well, if I don't have 6 people, I just have my own little brain. Can I deliberately, intentionally set aside my routine habits and adopt a different persona, a different perspective, and see it through a fresh lens, open-ended, just to see what might come about? If I can learn to adopt these different perspectives internally, I'm actually more able to receive ideas from others, but I also realize I'm not getting locked into my habitual forms of thinking. So perspective taking is very much like adopting different characters in a story. And the Fletcher treatment puts you into that situation all the time, where you look through a different lens, adopt a different persona, pick someone that you love or you hate or you admire, or somebody gives you a name and you try to adopt that perspective, and it frees up, gets you out of all of those old style habits. So I would say that perspective taking gives you new raw material to consider. Now, the second part, the plot twisting, now that I have all of these little pieces and insights laying around on the table, it's almost like little wooden blocks. I can start playing with the way I put them together and the shape and the orientation, and just the act of reconfiguring those into new patterns, that's like what my doctoral mentor, David Boji, says in his true storytelling model. That is, we're deliberately adjusting the players and the plot and the sequence and the setting. And so that actually generates new aha moments when you start re-storying or re-plotting or plot twisting. It shakes you out of the old habits and it gives you a fresh insights.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I suppose one of the mental blocks that people have with this is that there's a lot of rigor in this. There's a lot of, you kind of have to go through the process methodically and do, take on these different perspectives and then play out the plots going forward and, 1 month from now, 6 months, 3 years, whatever, and go through that rigor. And it's only in the complete process that you really benefit from doing this, and that you've got, but then that brings into your point from earlier that it's not all wasted. Everything else you've done is still valuable. And I think that part trips people up because it seems like, oh, that's a lot of work and I don't quite see what the value of it is.
Well, this is a really important point, especially in professions. It's important in all large organizations which have a value add and some proprietary knowledge that helps them create the value and allows them to be viable. So you don't want to disrespect that simply because I'm chasing creativity and that's all I need. No, you have to find a way to harmonize the creative impulses and insights with the rigor that comes from hard-earned knowledge. So professions especially so, because professions are entrusted with socially important missions and are given the authority to develop their best practices and the responsibility to provide good and value and virtue to the society that they serve. So if you are a member of a profession and you're trying to decide what to do with creativity, you never lose sight of the fact that I have an obligation to preserve that which is good and true. So rigor is sort of the other side of the coin, if I can say it that way, that we must respect the evidence of utility. How do we know that this thing that you proposed actually works? So it's not either or, it's actually and both. And in our profession, in the Army, we're actually very concerned about how you make that connection, the innovation pipeline management, where you go from the genuine insight of novelty into practical utility, into provable improvements, and then rapid fielding and scale. So we have learned you have to consider the entire supply chain or the value chain, and creativity actually helps you, though, at each one of those important points. So it's not replacing rigor. It's actually giving it more supportable energy and more insights at every point on the curve.
Hey, it's your host, Andrew here. I wanted to take a second just to say that if you're enjoying this podcast, we would love it if you did a couple of things for us. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. It really allows us to grow the channel and reach a lot more people like you. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, take a moment to leave us a rating and review. It's a great way to give us some feedback and to tell the world what you think about this podcast. So whether you listen to it on YouTube or you listen to it as a podcast, if you take one of those actions, it would mean the world to me and my team. Thank you. And with that, right back to the show. It sort of leads me to my next question I was going to ask was, how are you thinking about operationalizing this? And I know for many listeners, before you answer that question, Ken, it's what I'll do is actually, I think in the show notes, include some examples here so you can kind of see what the activities we've talked about are and what that practice routine looks like. But now, as you are taking that, how are you operationalizing it?
Well, here's one example. One of my students was interested in a research project, and so even when that was over, we carried it into the curriculum, and I created some space for him to explore ideas on how to apply those insights to the entry-level officers course for our bomb disposal school. So he's a EOD expert, explosive ordnance and demolition, so he defuses bombs. Now, there is no profession in the world that is more concerned with rigor and practitioner excellence than Bomb Squad. But he saw the value of this And he actually, we contacted the commander of that school for the Army, and we are engaged in a project right now to take a couple of those Fletcher exercises from that field guide and turn it into lesson plans that can be taught. And we actually did that this week with about an hour of preparation down there, and they got rave reviews. And we've got the entire schoolhouse down there much more interested in what we're doing. So what we're learning is that you can take a piece and start building on it and test it and taste it, and then make a decision on the basis of evidence how you should scale it and where else it can go. So you end up, we have now you live in New Jersey, so you're not familiar with the kudzu vine that is taking over the American South, but that's like dandelions or ivy. It just grows everywhere and you can't control it. And all of these little ideas, each one sparks 2 or 3 more ideas. It's almost like a hydra, I suppose, in that the scale takes care of itself, that the inspiration from the last cycle feeds forward into the next cycle. And then you start accumulating insights and comfort and techniques as you learn. You're learning into the technique, if I can say it that way.
Yeah. And so what are some of the challenges with channeling that creativity?
Well, there's a time sensitivity in many situations where you are desperately constrained by time of delivery. Like, I have to be on that objective or accomplish that mission or deliver this product at a date certain. And so you start backward planning in the usual way. How am I going to spend my time? So if I have my old reliable process that had the rigor, and now I propose to insert creativity in there, I have to find ways to accommodate the time that I'm spending, the resources that it takes. It's not much, but there's time and leader involvement. And then I have to do something with what comes out of this, out of these good ideas. And so you have to learn new ways of adjusting your planning process to account for the time that you spend in generating, developing, and applying creative insights. And I think that is the biggest challenge. It is to get leaders in the organization experienced in the method, in the model, so that they have a little more comfort in what's coming out of this. So this is not something that you can just drop a magic bean and it grows. You actually have to incorporate the entire organization and the culture. And that's why your work on culture is so interesting to me, is because it's an entire organizational perspective shift.
Yeah. Yeah. And you shared before we went on that you'd listened to a few of the previous episodes, and I'm like kind of very proud actually that some of that resonated with you, because my experience and what I try to share in some of those episodes is that there is no one size fits all approach to this that we've just talked about. That the sort of adoption of this approach to learning creativity is something that every company and every organization is going to need to figure out what works for them, right? And you have a good example of this, I would think, as well, because you also apply this method to teach a different audience altogether. And I'm curious, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about that audience, and then let's maybe do a compare and contrast of how it's been applied?
Yeah. So early in my career, I also developed an interest in financial markets and managing, money and, for my family, for retirements and all that, and discovered I had a knack at it because I have a mathematical brain. It turns out that the mindset of risk managers and asset allocators and investment managers is so similar to that of a battlefield commander in terms of working under uncertainty. Consequences of failure are extraordinary. The world is changing quickly. There's new technology like artificial intelligence. So the thought processes and the problem framing and the skill sets are so similar that it's eerie. And what I found is that when I started teaching professional traders and investment fund managers how to apply sort of these military decision-making models, that creativity ends up looking very similar in both of those domains. And that the insights that we gained from teaching creativity to Army officers was directly applicable to traders. So I just finished a 30-week course where we took each one of those 30 lessons in the Fletcher guidebook, and we did the short reading and the experiential learning. I added a trader's experiential learning. We combined, so that's two different perspectives on the central Fletcher idea. And then we came together in a recorded circle, and we actually shared with each other the big insights that we had from the individual work that we did. And we actually built a culture of trust and safety and communication around stories that enabled us to get some synergy and insights. And from that 30-week course, which was the first time we'd ever taught it, I just finished it like 2 weeks ago, guys came to that in order to learn how to trade, but it turned out that they were being transformed by this approach to creativity and problem solving. We actually started 4 new businesses, had 2 guys retire and become full-time traders, and the transformation that they reported on was astonishing. And I attributed back to the central idea of the creative spark and then the cultural environment of acceptance and respecting different points of view and being open to the insights of others. And that to me was the unexpected part of the creativity research. It's not just new ideas; it's how you actually process it and embrace it in a group. So we're pretty excited about that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that point up as well. That was one of the things that struck me the most in learning and talking to Angus about this and his wife is that sense of so I mean what you just described was with a group of individuals that came together to learn this. They weren't like a team to begin with, but what you just described is they kind of became a team in a way. And it sounds like, some relationships were in there, maybe joined up to come up with new ideas. And this idea of the trust, psychological safety, acceptance, respect, like you say, are some of the absolutely beautiful byproducts of doing this work. It's really quite phenomenal.
Yeah, the artifact that came out of that exercise is that we discovered for us this process of safety, trust, truth, and opportunity. Like they all came to that course as individual, secretive, lone rangers, and they wanted the opportunity. But then what they learned was that in order to get some group opportunities, they had to learn to trust each other. Well, before they could trust each other, they had to hear each other telling the truth. And before they did that, they had to have a safe place in which we could take the time to unpack who we were and then connect on a human level. And then it fed forward into this essentially a self-directed work team. There was no intention that was supposed to happen, but it was a natural byproduct of trusting each other in the creative process, telling stories about our experiences to each other without fear of judgment or critique or advice. We just told our true story of insight and let it set, and we just appreciated each other's gifts. And then what happened was that culture, a team built around that. It was not a group of individuals. It actually had become a team with its own little culture, and it's really a powerful thing to see.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that I think is probably one of the things I'm most excited about. It's actually hard to pick one thing. There's so much about this that's so fascinating and potentially momentous in terms of its impact it can have on an organization. As you are working with it now and continue to adapt these approaches and methodologies, what are you most excited about for where this could go?
Well, what I see that's so exciting is how easily adaptable to local circumstances the central ideas are. And I'll give you an example of that. So we reported on the findings of our research project in a large global teleconference to Army leaders. As a result of that, 3 or 4 different Army schools contacted us separately. How could we use some of that secret sauce over here? And so we've actually been doing outreach and helping them cut the clothes to fit. It's almost a bespoke solution. And with very little input from us, they're finding ways to right size it in their local circumstances. And one of the things you learn quickly is to respect the knowledge and skills and perspectives that are already there. So we're not telling them what to do. We're just showing them some ways that has worked, and then they find ways to bring it out. So I'm really excited about how the second and third order effects are propagating through the network. And that's actually what Sengi talks about, is that network learning effect, that the power of your learning network is 2 to the n, where n is the number of nodes. So as you start outreaching and talking and sharing stories, that network grows, and the compound return is astronomical. That's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, wow, Ken, we have so much more to talk about on this topic, because yeah, I think so similarly to you, that network knowledge idea, I think, is the key to future competitive advantage for companies around knowledge. One thing I want to just mention as well before we probably bring this to a close is you've started to see this work really well online, and listeners, longtime listeners of the show will know that's something that I'm a huge advocate of, like the idea of cohort-based learning in an online environment. All the things we talked about around trust and safety and truth, these are things that people are just a lot more comfortable with doing, even with strangers to begin with. And it's actually kind of incredible when you think you can bring people together in this online setting that they haven't really met each other yet, and do the types of activities that are in this book, and people will embrace those and then start to see the benefits of it, and then will never want to stop doing it. What's your reflection on just the sort of almost scalability of this, using online mediums?
Here was one of the ideas about reframing and shifting in perspectives, that you've talked before in other episodes about the challenges of COVID and distance learning, and how the easy solution is just to put a camera and a microphone on an expert, show slides, and boom, I set the knowledge out. What more could I do? And that's really not satisfying. Well, you would think that it's harder to build a sense of community and team online or through Zoom. But one of the things that we discovered by accident was that the controlled nature of the environment, let's say in Zoom, is such that it's easier to make small investments in trust and outreach to others you don't know, because you don't have a lot of other social calculus to overcome. Like if I go into a physical room and I got generals and colonels and guys in there, there's a physical reality in there that I have to overcome in order to start building trust in new ways, particularly if there's a strong hierarchy. It turns out that online, you can start investigating ways of working together to build your collaboration and your artifacts, and you can actually grow in trust and confidence in smaller steps, and then you have automatic time off to do your own personal reflection. You're not always under the gun. What I have seen, for example, in a weekend workshop where you've spent a lot of money and you've flown to a new city and you got 20 hours to spend with these people and these experts, you're trying to get all that done in 20 hours and you get saturated and there's no payoff. But it turns out that the online, if you reframe that and you take a look at the frequency and the duration and the purpose, you can start building out some of these collaborational artifacts that actually let you rapidly scale. And then it's easy to see how, online networks can scale. But that was an unintended consequence of having to do it through Zoom. And then we discovered just by reframing how it actually promotes rapid network growth. If you look at it for what it can do, not try to just replicate the physical classroom, but find ways to leverage what's unique and special about online. And then you try to find how to supplement with some of the things that you don't get, like, sharing physical space.
Yeah, you make such a good point there, actually, about how we had to reframe how you can reframe the way we almost convey information. It was very much like time boxed before by people having to fly in and travel and all that sort of thing, and then you had to fit it all in this 20 hours, like you said, versus now you're talking about a 30-week cohort right? Where and that to me, when you say 30-week cohort, that's not like 30 hours of or 30 weeks of intensive every single day. That's intentionally spaced out so that there's time for reflection, like you say, so that it becomes learning as a process and not as an event. Learning is happening all the time. It's not defined by the time you come together.
Well, exactly. As an example, we had in that cohort, we had 20 people that were from literally every continent except Antarctica. And so we built some standard global meeting times so that no matter what time zone you were in, you could come together for 90 minutes and share your story of the work that you had done on the lesson, plus your reflection and the short story that you wanted to share with the inspirational moment. And then that became like popcorn popping. Well, it turned out that those times that we had fenced off became such high priority that people would fight in order to get there. They made it such a priority that they said, hey, I just need my people, that if I don't get that fix, I feel cut off from my tribe. And that was astonishing, especially when you could not have come up with a more, a wider variety of people. I mean, we had Singapore, Australia, Canada, the UK, and different time frames and ages and cultures. And yet, within about 4 weeks, 4 sessions of 90 minutes, the group identity was forming, and they were shaping their own personal group rules for how they were going to proceed. And it was amazing.
Yeah, that's another great point. The idea of community self-forming, they're bound by common interest and some sort of shared vision, I would assume, and that's really all it is, right? And those are the constraints within, and it's very principles based, and within that they form the community. They learn from each other. They take turns teaching and learning, and it's incredibly just organic, isn't it?
Yeah. What was astonishing was you actually get a variety of perspectives and goals and outcomes in the room. It's like everybody doesn't have to agree on what that group has to do, but you come in and you start sharing those creative ideas and stories. Sometimes the insight that person had is directly applicable to you, but sometimes just the fact that you were, hey, I had guys that were intraday traders. They're in a position for 2 to 3 minutes, and another guy only makes a decision once a month. But he could listen to that short story from the Angus Fletcher prompt, and suddenly hearing that story, it triggered a different response in a completely different direction. And they didn't have to come to an agreement on what to do. Just the fact that they were in a trusting environment and were sharing these insights generates the kind of creative response that actually can help you unlock your problem. And so you get both depth and width, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it took the words out of my mouth, and that's also a key point there, that there's no like need for collective agreement. Like there's a shared vision, there's common interest, but you don't need collective agreement. You can have, and there's still room for personal vision. There's still room for personal mastery, personal pathways that each person follows, but they get to draw from the collective knowledge of the group to be able to decide what next steps to take.
That's an important part of culture, is that it's not just the individual creativity, but you're coming to that community dining table and you're bringing your food and you share it with each other for your own purpose, and off it goes. It's beautiful.
This is beautiful. Last point on this. What are your thoughts on ways to help people make it practical? Because, that I can see being a point where people, they don't actually go, there's no bias to action, or people don't always have that as a intrinsic, motivation there to have that bias to action. How are you thinking about prompting that?
Well, what I think is by deliberately bite-sized chunks, eat the elephant one bite at a time. The smaller steps, make haste slowly is sort of my motto on this. That I want to give you an inspirational application. I coach youth soccer, and I had a 5-year-old team, and I stopped lecturing to them about the beauty of soccer, and we just let the ball be the best teacher. And what I do now is I pull these little guys together and I kneel down so that my eyes are lower than their eyes, so they can look down and see me as an equal. And I just ask them, does anybody have a plan? And little Dominic, who is on the ADHD spectrum, when we first started, he was not verbal and could not make eye contact. And after about 4 weeks of listening to these little kids tell their stories about soccer, Dominic offered me this plan. He said, Coach, I have a plan. I said, Dominic, what is your plan? He said, I think we should protect our goal, get the ball, go to goal, shoot and score. And I asked the other kids, hey, what do you guys think of Dominic's plan? And they loved it. And then they had plans. And so we put that together. And now these guys were empowered and excited, and they were going to tell their story, and they were free to play the game, and the ball just teaches you how to play. So my point would be is that action, it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. You just need one step. Here's the way I like to put it. The longest distance between point A and point B is a straight line because the world is changing so much. You start in one direction and then B moves and A is moving. So you're always adjusting. As long as you take the next good step, you're moving towards a better position. And so if you can learn to just bite-sized chunks, but then add to that momentum, you're going to start iterating towards success. You're going to approximate towards success. And you have that creative energy that's giving you the juice to keep going. And I would say start smaller than you think you have to. Take a smaller step than you think you should. And just try to get one little thing and then talk about it and share it with others. And you'll see that people start offering these little bite-sized nuggets. And pretty soon, you've got irresistible momentum. The opposite of that is trying to have some gigantic master plan. And those just don't survive contact with the world. So start small, keep going is what I would say.
Yeah, and treat it as a process. And that's such a beautiful story there, Dominic, doing a great job there of sort of seeing the big picture and breaking it down into its most fundamental principles. And then what it sounds like the rest of the team kind of fed off that energy and started to fill in all the detail that needed to happen to kind of do those things. Really amazing.
Yeah. I actually had to bring them off the bench and onto the field sooner because now everybody has a plan. They heard Dominic with his plan, and now they all got to have a plan. So it was like, oh, me next. And so pretty soon you have 5-year-olds who are really active and present and excited and taking ownership of their team, and they just find that energy and go, and they don't worry about falling down or missing the shot because they can't wait for the next play. And that's the kind of affirmative action orientation that we want, that creativity can really spawn.
Well, Ken, like I said at the beginning, this conversation could go on for many hours. I know you are a busy man. I'm going to say let's call it round one, and perhaps we can find some time to do another episode like this because I thoroughly enjoyed that. It was absolutely fascinating. I want to really thank you for taking the time to come share that experience with us. And I want to give you an opportunity to kind of share some last words. And it could be something you would encourage people to go check out. It could be words of advice, anything that you want to close with.
Well, I would just say, as a soccer coach, we teach our players, trust your feet, practice hard, but trust your feet and express yourself. And that's the best. Play that game going forward. Trust those creative impulses. Do something proper with it. Respect all of the voices that are there. Just keep going. I would invite people to take a look at Angus Fletcher's website. If you just Google up Angus Fletcher, you'll find him in Project Narrative at Ohio State University. I would also say Google up David Boje, B-O-J-E, at the TrueStorytellingInstitute.com to see how the exchange of information in a healthy, holistic way allows us to create those group spaces and group teams that allow us to turn creativity into action. What I found was that the intersection, the union of those two, the story science of Angus Fletcher and the true storytelling of David Bogie is what actually helps us create this safety, trust, truth that leads to opportunity. So I would be happy to talk with anybody that's interested with these ideas. I think you have my contact info, and I'm happy to reach out and chat, because it's better than working. I'll tell you what, this is much more fun than shoveling coal,
Amen. Amen to that, which is why I could talk to you about this for days. You've put me on a rabbit hole. I haven't heard of David. In South Africa, we would say Boyer. But I'm excited to learn a bit more about him and to look at how his work intersects with Angus's.
He's an interesting guy. He actually he invented the genre of organizational storytelling about 40 years ago. Now, he comes not from story science. He comes from the postmodern French critical thinking, indigenous ways of knowing, and yet the intersection of story science and his approach to narrative are just mutually supporting. He was my doctoral mentor, and I've learned so much from both of those guys that it's it's a joy to learn from them. But you'll enjoy the Bogie rabbit hole if I'm any predictor of the future.
Yeah, I'm on it. I'm looking forward to that. Ken, thank you so much again for your time. This was an absolutely fascinating conversation.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Good luck and Godspeed.
Hello. I hope you enjoyed that episode. It's Andrew again with a quick message. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is to leave us ratings and reviews where you listened. If you're on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe buttons, and feel free to leave a comment. We love hearing from our listeners and viewers. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please take the time to give us a rating and leave a review. Once again, we love hearing from our loyal listeners. If you're listening to this on Spotify, please hit the follow button to make sure that you don't miss new episodes as they come out. See you next week for another episode of the Learning Culture Podcast. Thank you for listening.